So, yeah, our obsession with privatisation, our obsession with flexible labour markets means that we can't look at a problem like this and see an obvious solution. And that is saying to security guards at a particular place, this is it.
Yeah.
Guess what? If I work on a chicken farm, I'm not allowed to work on another chicken farm. Right? Because we know how quarantine works.
Yeah.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Don't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and we're recording this on Tuesday the 8th of December 2020. And today we thought we'd take a look back at the first pandemic episode of Follow the Money we recorded way back in March this year with Richard Dennis, when we first asked, what the hell is happening to the economy? And to reflect on some of the huge changes that we've seen in Australia's economy and its politics over this unprecedented year, many of which were unthinkable all the way back in February and then became national policy within a matter of months. And just to remind you, Australia's economy was already stuck in the mud before the pandemic hit. It was pretty weak. Wages growth was the slowest on record since World War II. I think it's now the slowest on record ever. And the Reserve Bank was basically sending the federal government engraved invitations to start spending, to provide some fiscal stimulus, but the government would not bite.
Well, 2020, what a year.
2020 has been a year of, I think, great resilience.
The assessment that COVID-19 can be characterised as a pandemic.
The states began to close their borders, and Australians were told to stay home unless it was absolutely necessary to travel.
This will put us all to the test. At no time like this since the Second World War.
$4 billion. That is the grim weekly cost to Australia's economy of the coronavirus restrictions.
This was the economists' version of Armageddon.
There has been more heartbreak outside Centrelink offices as thousands of jobless Australians are forced to seek financial support.
So the size and breadth of the economic lifeline being thrown to the private sector to save businesses and protect jobs has no precedent in Australia's history.
By the end of the day, more than 1 million Australians would have been had their claims processed for JobSeeker. Around 5 million are estimated to be on JobKeeper.
With all its announcements taken together, the government's now given itself a massive $320 billion economic water bomb to dump on the coronavirus emergency as it burns through the economy.
Today we start the final week in Parliament for 2020, and back home Victoria marks 38 straight days since our last case of COVID-19.
So hopefully some of this spirit of looking after people and each other will really continue after this crisis.
We'll get through this together, Australia.
So to reflect a little on 2020 and what we've learned about Australian economics and politics, I'm joined by Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, Richard Dennis. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
So back in March, I was just listening back to that very first episode that we did after the pandemic had hit. And you described the effect of the pandemic as enormous as any shock since World War II and arguably bigger than that. Do you think you called that right?
Like fine wine, Ebony. I think our podcast has aged very well. Look, it's terrible. Like the recession we're experiencing is 4 times bigger than the 1991 recession. World War II killed a lot more people. I'm not talking about the health consequences here, but we were fully employed during World War II. And we came out of it with a lot of debt. But here we're seeing mass unemployment. It's not going away. We'll talk about the timing, I'm sure, but we are by no means out of the woodwork in terms of high unemployment. It's going to stay that way for a long time. And, we're coming out with enormous amounts of debt, just like we did in World War II. So, look, the official forecasters early on, the Reserve Bank and Treasury said GDP might fall by 8 to 10%. Well, it fell around 7%. That's slightly better than people expected, but again, that's 4 times bigger than the 1991 recession.
Yeah, so even though it's less than predicted, it's still really bloody bad.
Oh, it's terrible. Think about what that means. It means that the economy in the middle of this year was 7% smaller than it was a year before that. What we're seeing in Australia is less stuff being made, less people being employed, lower national income, and the consequences of that are terrible. And to the government's credit, they did listen to me. They did listen to the Australia Institute's research agenda, and they've injected hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. And by the way, that's why things are doing better than people thought.
Yeah.
It's not an accident that GDP wasn't, the collapse in GDP wasn't as bad as we thought. When those forecasts were getting made, no one was expecting the government to spend $100 billion on stimulus in March and April. So all of that stimulus has helped prop the economy up. A lot of money was spent boosting unemployment benefits with a supplement, and it worked. It lifted the living standards of lots of low-income earners. It helped those most in need. And now we're in this bizarre situation. While unemployment's still high, youth unemployment's still twice the unemployment rate for the community as a whole, we're talking about winding it down even further.
We have always said that the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker COVID supplement were temporary measures. And I think Australians understand that.
1.5 million Australians, expected to increase to 1.8 million Australians by the end of the year, according to government numbers, will be told that they're going back to living on $40 a day at the end of March. It's not adequate and it's not good enough, and the government should fix it.
No thanks to the Morrison government, who cut JobKeeper and JobSeeker by $300 a fortnight to Victorians in the middle of stage 4 lockdown.
So where to from here? Don't know. It doesn't look good at the moment. But yeah, it's a catastrophic event. We've handled it from a health point of view very well, arguably amongst the best in the world. From an economic point of view, we've handled it pretty well. But from a fairness point of view, I fear we're really on the cusp of stuffing it up.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot this year about a range of things, one of them being how neoliberalism has made us pretty weak in our responses. But we did talk earlier in the year as well to Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz about the pandemic and the potential for it to make inequality worse. Now, we did see the government early on, for example, lifted tens of thousands of people out of poverty by doubling JobSeeker, but they're now cutting that away. It's going to reduce again, I think, just after Christmas. How bad are we stuffing it up when you say, you fear we're heading down the wrong direction?
Oh, well, we're on the cusp of stuffing it up quite badly. When the economy ground to a halt because we told it to grind to a halt, we imposed all sorts of restrictions on industries like travel and hotels, obviously, but also a whole bunch of people didn't want to go out and shop and do things because they didn't want to get sick. So by design, we kind of shut large parts of the economy down. That was terrible. But the government briefly was pouring a lot of money in. That was helping to keep people's incomes up. It was helping keep people in work. And that was a typically Keynesian response. They got dragged there, but to their credit, they did it. And now we're drifting back to old-fashioned neoliberalism. You're hearing the government talk about all these fictional jobs that can't get filled because people won't look hard enough. The whole we're being too kind to the poor. Yeah. If we really want to solve unemployment, we have to be nasty to the poor. This is old-fashioned neoclassical neoliberal economics. It's never worked. There's a reason that there's mass unemployment. There hasn't been an outbreak of laziness. There hasn't been an outbreak of skilllessness. There's a massive shortage of jobs. So we're starting to see this neoliberal language when it comes to being nasty to unemployed people. We're starting to see the neoliberal language when it comes to saying, well, we have to stop spending money now because while spending money to prop up the economy 6 months ago was a good idea, we can't keep borrowing forever. and this is classic, the forever. Is anyone suggesting forever? Is forever on the table? It's like when I'm eating dinner, I might make a pig of myself, but I'm not going to eat forever.
Yeah.
So, we're borrowing a lot of money at the moment, but while the economy is still in this terrible state, we should keep doing that.
Yeah.
So to argue that we have to stop now because we did it 6 months ago, again, they're turning their back on Keynesianism and embracing neoliberalism again. And then there's just being nasty to casuals. The fact is we're using the middle of this crisis to rewrite industrial relations laws in ways that employers always wanted.
Law would do is override those decisions of the courts and entrench or make legal, really, the ability of employers just to put a label on you, call you a casual, even if you've got ongoing work and you've got no sick leave or annual leave, and take away your right to ever ask for those sick leave or annual leave. So that's the one way it takes rights off workers.
And of course, one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that casuals are more likely to go to work when they're sick, for example, and expose themselves and other people to danger because they don't have sick pay. This is not complicated stuff.
I think at the very beginning in that first episode you talked about, we need to massively expand the public service, whether or not it's people helping file, for Centrelink and for JobSeeker, but it seems really obvious in hindsight. Shouldn't we have just employed a bunch of people full-time to be on the public service payroll for hotel quarantine?
Yes.
And so they didn't have to work multiple jobs.
Exactly. We should have done that. We absolutely should have done that. And we also should have done something similar with our aged care centres, for example. These are the most high-risk places in the society, both because of the architecture and because of the demographics of who's in them. Yet we've got a whole bunch of casual aged care workers who are kind of required to work at multiple venues, exposing themselves to greater risk and, of course, exposing the people they're caring for. So, our obsession with privatisation, our obsession with flexible labour markets means that we can't look at a problem like this and see an obvious solution. And that is saying to security guards at a particular place, this is it.
Yeah.
You work here. This is the only place you work. Now, this sounds incredibly intrusive, and I've had a few debates with people about how you couldn't possibly do that. So, being a researcher, I did a bit of research, and guess what? If I work on a chicken farm, I'm not allowed to work on another chicken farm. Right? Because we know how quarantine works.
Yeah.
All right, and if I'm the most likely cause to carry a virus from one chicken farm to another.
Yeah.
We do it for pigs as well. And when you work at one of these places, you have to sign a declaration saying, I won't.
Yeah.
So we know how to stop disease spreading between chicken farms and between pig farms. And in fact, all sorts of employers, including a lot of people in the media, are prevented from working for anyone else.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to moonlight if you're a columnist or a commentator or a journalist working for a whole bunch of media companies. But those same media companies saying how outrageous that you would ask someone to work at one and only place possibly work for an employer who obliges them or requires them to do exactly the same thing.
So coming back to this idea of making inequality worse, we have actually seen the government this year do several things that I just never thought I would see. So first of all, they dumped the target for having a budget surplus. That went fairly early on.
Big win for the Australia Institute. Well done, team. We
did
like
a 20-year campaign.
Not sure it was all us, by the way.
But we gave it a red-hot go, Rich, and we got there in the end.
I'll never forget last year's whiteboard planning exercise. But let's not talk of it now.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But they also, as we mentioned, they doubled JobSeeker, formerly known as New Start, lifting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Australians out of poverty. They made childcare free. I think state governments pretty much ended homelessness by just homing people out on the streets.
Yeah, put them in hotels and rented houses for them.
Exactly.
Crazy talk.
And the last one, I guess, is the wage subsidy scheme, JobKeeper, which the union movement pushed incredibly hard for and the federal government was resistant to, and probably only did because of those massive lines out the front of Centrelink. So even though we're at this moment when we're about to stuff it up, we did get heaps of things right for short periods of time this year.
Oh, absolutely. And as I said, my fear is that we're kind of going to make it worse. Like, we've kind of proved that we can do this stuff.
Yeah.
We've proved that it works. And then the weird takeout is, so we've got to stop doing that. Now, it's interesting, a lot of people say, oh, well, yeah, we can't keep doing it forever because, always got a reason, can't do it forever because. Except we've just given me a nice big tax cut forever. And actually, I'm promised another nice big tax cut in a few years, forever. So much of the critique of government intervention is, it's okay to do it in the middle of the crisis, but you can't bake it in. You can't introduce things like free childcare and let them stay there. It has to be temporary and targeted. Well, we mocked that 6 months ago. I think I was quite clear there's nothing temporary or targeted. This is going to be sustained and structural. Well, my tax cuts aren't temporary and my tax cuts aren't targeted.
Yeah.
So, when we want to spend money on helping people with actual problems, can only do it for 3 or 6 months, prove we can do it, prove it works. But when it comes to tax cuts and IR reform and the things they always wanted to do it in the middle of a crisis.
And they've got to be permanent.
And they're permanent. Yeah. There's got to be permanent. But going up a level, so we've proved that we can do stuff. We've proved that it works. It's silly to say we have to stop. Our elected representatives want to stop. But let's go up a level. What we've actually seen in the last 6 months is that governments are really good at solving some problems.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think government's good at solving all problems. I don't need government in my life in all sorts of ways. But in the middle of this pandemic, particularly the state governments stepped in, led and acted. They used their voice, they used their leadership role to tell people what to do, and they put policies and supports in. And it worked. And we can look around the world and see that not everyone did that. We can look at America today, which I can't think too hard about without getting quite sad. You can look at what's happening in the UK. It's possible, in fact, most countries have stuffed this up.
Yep.
So after decades of neoliberalism telling us the state is hopeless, let's be clear, in Australia the state has been really quite effective. I'm not saying they've done it all. I'm saying they've led it, they've shaped it, they've guided it, they've funded it, and the spread of the virus in Australia is far lower than anyone thought. Number of deaths is far lower than anyone thought, and that wasn't inevitable. That was good public administration.
Yeah, and I really do think Julia Gillard nailed it when she talked about that the pandemic had revealed that who's elected does matter, who's in charge does matter when it comes to things like this.
Well, that's right. And who's sitting around thinking, what we need for this pandemic, some more market forces. I think what we need is a bit more libertarian deregulation and it's crazy. Of course who we elect makes a difference. It always has. If who was in power didn't make a difference, why do so many Conservatives fight so hard to get there? So it's obvious who's in power makes a difference. Donald Trump has imposed an enormous toll on the American people. He'll be remembered for that, and perhaps mainly for that.
I mean, the death toll is just breathtaking.
Look, you now have more than 200,000 cases a day, and that's before we get the spike that will come after Thanksgiving. It's just horrible to think about. And here we are in Australia. We are a lucky country, but it wasn't luck that stopped the outbreak in Australia. Yes, we're lucky to be on an island, but it was not luck that stopped it. It was Daniel Andrews making hard decisions in Victoria. It was McGowan in Western Australia making hard decisions. It was Gladys making hard decisions in New South Wales.
Who would have thought in 2020 that some states would choose to close their borders? Now, that was an issue that came to National Cabinet, which not all of us adopted. That's another example of why the Federation doesn't always work on the law of averages. Every state has different conditions.
That now is the time to open up. Now is the time to congratulate every single Victorian for staying the course. Now is the time to thank every single Victorian family for being guided by the data, the science and the doctors.
We've been able to do things more in Queensland because we have taken those proactive steps. We've kept Queenslanders safe. So I hope this gives Queenslanders confidence to get out there and enjoy their state.
I think now we can look back and kind of say, oh yeah, that was an obvious decision in hindsight, but things like shutting internal state borders, hotel quarantine,
ignoring Peter Credlin.
Exactly. Those would have been really tough decisions at the time.
Oh, indeed. And, I'm sitting here getting chills thinking about it. Imagine how the history books will record this. Imagine in 5 years' time when we can hear a dispassionate account of how the Prime Minister came to the conclusion that we needed to shut all of our borders with every country.
Yeah.
Like, who gets elected thinking that's in their in tray?
Yeah.
Daniel Andrews with 700 cases thinking it's today or it's never.
Yeah.
And imagine, hopefully he was surrounded by people giving him advice, some of which was don't do it. I'd like to think someone was in the room explaining what the consequences in terms of economic consequences and mental health and other consequences. It was not an easy decision, but our elected representatives in Australia made those hard decisions, and of course they matter. And if one thing comes out of this crisis, I'd like to think it's that people have faith in the ability of governments to fix problems, which is different from faith in individuals who happen to be in the seat.
Yeah.
We need, we've got so good at mocking politicians that we've kind of turned it into mocking democratic institutions.
Yeah.
And look around the world if you want to see what a real cock-up looks like.
Speaking of the people who did get us through this pandemic, I went to listen to Sally McManus last week at the Press Club, and she was talking about the essential workers who did get us through this pandemic. And it
You mean the bankers and the senior
share traders.
The best paid people in the country who perform the most essential services.
That's right. The CEOs of Qantas, sacking tens of thousands of people. No, it was cleaners. It was the grocery store checkout people, the people packing the shelves, the truck drivers who take the groceries from farm to Woolies and Coles. It's doctors, nurses, the childcare workers who we don't pay very much, teachers who always get derided, a lot of them public servants.
The heroes of 2020 are all the essential workers, hardworking, brave and humble. When the pandemic is over, they deserve a parade and the keys to our city, a permanent and enduring acknowledgement of what they did to support our country in a crisis.
But none of the jobs that I think probably before this pandemic that anyone would have thought were necessarily essential.
No, exactly. And of course, as a society, we've kind of built up weird stories about what real jobs are, what important jobs are, what essential jobs are. And of course, the whole point of economics is that we all gain from trade. The whole point of economics is that lots of people specialising in some tasks and then exchanging with other people is far better than us all trying to do stuff by ourselves. And, I live a weird life with my interest in economics. There's lots of bad stuff done in the name of economics. There absolutely is. But at its heart, economics is about the gains from trade and understanding that when we consume resources to do one thing, we give up the resources to do something else. And sure, in a bushfire, as Scott Morrison would say, the guy with the hose is essential. Absolutely, in a bushfire, the guy, and he said guy with a hose is essential. But you know what? In a highly contagious pandemic, the cleaner is essential. And when your intensive care wards are filling up or your aged care wards are trying to contain a virus, then trained nurses are our essential workers. So this idea that the mining industry or emergency services or some small group, brackets usually blokes, of people are the essential workers and the rest of us kind of sit back and somehow benefit from that, it's not economics.
Yeah.
And different crises reveal the need for different skills. And as anyone that did some homeschooling this year knows, teaching's not easy.
Damn straight. So I want to talk a little bit about who got left out of all of this, because there were some really notable omissions that I think go to your point about inequality. So the whole university sector got carved out a couple of different times from JobKeeper.
So is it enough, Alan Finkel, for the government to just say, well, universities get a lot of government backing already, that funding will remain there, but not do any more, and in fact keep them out of the JobKeeper program?
Look, it's a genuine concern. People on short
short-term contracts and casuals are at risk of losing their jobs. The universities are trying as hard as they can, but it's not clear for how long they can keep those jobs open.
We've seen TAFEs really decimated all over the country and a big drop in apprenticeship figures as well. But we hope that there's more funding that's going to go into that sector as part of the stimulus.
People here on visas, migrants, casual workers missed out. There were whole sections of the community who were basically left with absolutely nothing except whatever savings they had at the time. How much does that weaken our society and do damage that we might not know about right now?
It does enormous damage, and I hope it does some good as well, because we're all in this together. I wish I could sing, because then I'd sing bullshit. We're not in this together, because as you said, like particularly skilled migrants who came to Australia at our invitation and were performing skilled work for us, working in kitchens, working in hospitals, working all around the place. We just said, well, sure, you might have lost your job because COVID, but we're just going to ignore you when it comes to providing support. What an appalling thing for us to have done. As you said, the university sector, what a terrible score-settling exercise that was. I mean, and it's a big if, we were taking economics seriously and equality seriously and people seriously, we would have done the opposite. We would have said, look, I'm so sorry, young people coming out of school, your odds of getting a job haven't been this low in 30 years.
Yeah.
For 3 years, we're going to make uni free. And in order to provide that, we're going to have to employ a whole bunch of additional teachers at TAFE or at uni or wherever, because we don't want you to feel left out. We don't want you sitting around looking for jobs that don't exist. So how about we invest in you, and how about we create a lot of jobs while we're investing in you? But no, we did the opposite. We said the unis couldn't have access to JobKeeper, and we're laying off the staff that one day we're going to need again.
And I often think about the international university students who got stuck here in many cases, couldn't make it home in time, or didn't have enough money to pull together to be able to make it home in time.
Or didn't have anywhere safe to go.
Didn't have anywhere safe to go, who ended up being fed by charities because we absolutely just did nothing to help them, and in a situation of no fault of their own. And we just, why would any international student come to Australia anymore if they know that's how we treat people in a disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. And, people are thinking about foreign policy more than they have for a long time. What a missed opportunity for Australia to earn enormous goodwill, not just with the young people who happened to be here at the time, but with their friends and their communities back home. What a low-cost way for Australia to have built enormous goodwill in Asia while just doing the right thing and being nice. So, again, at a big picture level, did the government spend a lot of money? Yes. Was that the right thing to do? Yes. But the size of the stimulus is quite different from the shape.
Yeah.
And it was not accidentally shaped. It is not an accident that I got a tax cut and we still and we say we couldn't afford to keep providing free childcare. It was not an accident that the unis were left out. It was not an accident that migrant workers were left out. The government was dragged to a big stimulus, and again, to their credit, good on them. I'm glad they did it. The reason GDP didn't shrink as far as it could have was because they listened.
Yeah.
But in handing out that enormous sum of money, there's no doubt that their friends got more than their fair share, and groups that they either didn't care about or thought just won't ever vote for them because they can't vote for them, missed out. And I think that will shape the way we see ourselves, and other countries will see us.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot this year about the shape of a stimulus and what a good economic reconstruction would look like. You've talked a lot about delivering things with lasting benefits to the community. Looking at how the government has spent its money this year, it's not clear to me really any lasting benefits?
No. Look, a lot of that is unfortunately been effective stimulus, but ineffective at reshaping our society. We talk so much about creating jobs, right? And of course we need to create jobs right now. But let's be clear, going and building an enormous pyramid made of concrete in the middle of nowhere will create jobs.
Yeah.
It'll work. Right? Did the people that made the concrete get a job? Yes. The people that poured the concrete get a job? Yes.
Yeah.
The question is, in 5 or 10 years' time, are we excited to have a big lump of concrete in the middle of nowhere? Probably not.
Yeah.
So we hear all this, we're spending all this money on infrastructure, we're spending all this money on this and that. Great. Of course that will, quote, create some jobs in the short term. But is it going to create lasting benefits for us? So, yeah, we've suggested throughout the recession that when it comes to spending money, the government needs to have some clear criteria. One of which is it should focus on labour-intensive activities, like childcare, like aged care, like education. Per $1 million spent, pretty much all you're employing is labour. So, of course, you create a lot of jobs per $1 million. And we think that the government should be spending money on things that are both labour-intensive and that deliver lasting benefits. I don't know, like education. But so much of the stimulus has either been provided in the form of tax cuts, again, to people lucky enough like myself to have secure jobs and above average incomes, stuff money into my pocket if people want to, but that's not the best way to create jobs in the economy.
Yeah.
Taking that same amount of money we spend on tax cuts and spending it on childcare workers will first of all create jobs. And guess what they'll do with the money we pay them?
Spend it in the economy?
Some say. All buried in that big pile of concrete I was just talking about. So yeah, when you spend the money directly on employing people, you get a big, what's called first-round effect. And the first-round effect, they go spend the money. They probably spend even a higher proportion of their money than the people getting the tax cut. So, we're going to spend $500 million on an updo for the War Memorial. Okay, we could spend that money on domestic violence centres. These choices will have lasting consequences.
And certainly that choice seems in a very different light now that we've had the Brereton report and evidence of war crimes.
Absolutely. I actually, while I was opposed to the enormous indulgent expenditure in the first place, as were many returned soldiers, I think now we have to have a whole rethink about, well, what exactly are we memorialising and how? Now seems like a terrible time to rush it. But, I've used this example countless times, but I can't get it out of my head. The last time we had a recession this big, the Great Depression in the 30s, we built beautiful ocean baths that people are still swimming in today.
Yeah, for free.
For free, because that's how rich we were during the Great Depression. The things we build today, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's new public transport infrastructure, or whether it's war memorials, the decisions we make about what things to build don't just determine how many jobs we create today, they determine whether we get lasting benefits or not. And again, who we elect matters, because the people that don't want to spend money on renewable energy but do want to have a gas-fired economy, 20 years after they leave office, their preferences will still shape Australia.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to cut our way out of this crisis. Cuts to tax mean cuts to services and cuts to government spending, which we're going to need to invest to grow jobs. The pathway out of this isn't going to be blue cuts and blue austerity. It's going to be green growth. We want a strategy to recover from this crisis. One of the best ways of bouncing back after the corona crisis would be to boost renewable energy spending in Australia.
I want to move away, I guess, from the year in review now and just finish up by casting ahead and looking forward.
That's what economists are for. Accurate forecasting, Ebony, accurate forecasting.
Well, I want to start with climate change because we've seen kind of the government flirting with the idea of not cheating anymore by using Kyoto carryover credits, but it still doesn't have an invitation to the next round of international climate ambition talks. We've still got all this rhetoric around about a gas-led recovery. I mean, is our recovery going to be gas-led? Is there any evidence of that? Any reason to think that that's where we're headed?
It might be gas politically led, but not economically. And by that, I guess what I'm trying to say is we might go waste a couple of $2 billion on new pipelines, more subsidies for gas. We can miss out on lots of opportunities and pour some concrete where we don't need it. But I don't think we're going to have a gas-led recovery because economics, because reality. A shortage of gas is not what's constraining employment creation in Australia. COVID is. The Northern Territory used to have the cheapest gas in the country, and manufacturing was declining up there. So, the Australian Institute's published some great research on this. The number one thing we do with gas in Australia is export it to other countries.
Yeah.
The number two thing we do is burn gas in order to liquefy it so we can export it. And the number three thing we do with it is so small you can barely see it on the same graph. So we're not going to have a gas-led recovery because there's no shortage of gas that's causing fundamental problems in our economy today. But I fear we're going to blow a whole bunch of money on that as well. In terms of climate change, look, who can say, but Australia has been out on its own for 30 years on climate diplomacy. We are kind of the blocker in chief. The other countries that are blockers in the same way that Australia is include countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia. But no one kind of expects them to behave nice. Australia's been this wolf in sheep's clothing. We kind of pretend to care and we go to international talks and we ruin them. And everyone knows this. Everyone overseas knows this. But now we've got this fascinating position that we're in. Australia's feeling pretty lonely down here, having a trade war with China all by itself. No, I mean this.
For sure.
More than any time in the last 30 years, I think we're feeling a bit of tyranny of distance. We're feeling a little outpost at the arse end of the world, as Paul Keating once called it. And we need friends, and we want friends. And an easy way to have friends would be to stop being climate blockers. And we know that Boris Johnson has rung the Prime Minister and said, lift your game. And we know that Matthias Cormann's travelling around Europe saying, hey, can I be the head of the OECD?
Lol, ignore my...
Yeah. And we know what he's getting told.
Yeah.
You're kidding, aren't you? Aren't you the guy that? Weren't you bragging about ripping down a carbon price?
Yeah.
We've got one in Europe, right?
Yeah.
The sky didn't fall. When we introduced ours, you were going to introduce yours as well.
Wasn't it you just talking about the gas-led recovery?
Exactly. So, look, I don't want to be too Pollyanna here, but Australia has been proud of its isolationism on climate change for 30 years. We literally held up the whole Kyoto process and insisted that while virtually every other country in the world was agreeing to emission reductions, we got an increase.
Yeah.
We redefined the definition of a tree in something called the Australia Clause in order to generate all these dodgy credits. So we've been at the kind of go-it-alone climate obstructionism for decades, and maybe we'll keep doing that. But I think right now, whether it's the reaction of our friends in the Pacific, with the preferences of our friends in Europe, the demands of an incoming Biden government, I think it's a hard time for Australia to give a middle finger to our allies on something like climate change that they care about, while we're asking them to, maybe drink our wine at dinner.
And we can get it right. I firmly believe that action on climate change can actually reduce emissions, but also create jobs and reduce power prices.
So, Richard, one of the things I have noticed reflecting on this year, and that's made me a bit more positive, has been state governments really stepping up on climate change, but they've also obviously played a huge role during the pandemic. Do you think that's one of the key things to come out of 2020, the role of state governments?
Absolutely. Go the premiers. Look at the opinion polls. Across the board, all states, Labor and Liberal, incumbent premiers are shooting the lights out. Anastasia Palaszczuk just had a 5% swing. 5% swing to her to win office for the third time.
Here's some more good news. Up to 200 people can attend a wedding. And where's Lydia? all guests can dance.
What you're saying is that we can finally get back on the beers?
I don't know that I'll be drinking a beer tonight. I might go a little higher up the shelf.
So the public like what they see. I think they like the strong, clear leadership. And by leadership, I don't mean telling everyone what to do. I mean telling people what needs to be done. People don't love getting told to wear masks. I'm not suggesting that. But the voters clearly like government saying, there's a problem, I got this. Here's what we need to do. Obviously, some people don't like the diagnosis. Some people don't like the cure. But the overwhelming majority of people like the clear leadership and the people taking responsibility. And at the same time, we're seeing that, the states actually do have the power to say to the federal government, get stuffed, I'm doing it my way.
Yeah.
Now, there's this wonderful kind of political jiu-jitsu going on here because Conservative federal governments have for decades won enormous votes by protecting their borders. It's worked a treat.
Yeah.
Defending themselves against, asylum seekers, refugees, all the humanity. Well, guess what? When the Premier said, well, I'm going to protect my borders from a deadly virus, well, voters like that even more from across the political spectrum. So, I think that the premiers have really got enormous standing at the moment, and I really hope they use it. We used to have the Premiers' Conference. We now have the boring COAG. I think the premiers should...
Well, now we have National Cabinet that we don't even hear from.
Well, there's that. But I actually think the premiers should come together without the Prime Minister. I'm not saying they shouldn't meet with the Prime Minister. Of course they should. But in isolation, I think the premiers should come together regularly and say, well, what do we want? What's good for us? What do we collectively want from the federal government? Because it's quite clear when it comes to climate change. It's quite clear when it comes to health policy. It's quite clear when it comes to so many issues. It's just harder to resolve things at the federal level than we'd like it to be. So how about the premiers kind of step up to the plate and say, well, you know what? As premiers, we can all agree that we should put a tax on sugar and we'd spend every cent we get on health.
Yeah.
So there you go, I fixed it for you.
Yeah.
But in some sense that sounds ridiculous, but it kind of is as simple as that.
Yeah.
That is actually how John Howard got the GST through. John Howard went to the premiers and said, if you'll back me in for the new tax, you can have all the money.
Yeah.
So, he cast such a long shadow, John Howard, in Australia, and we kind of now think, oh yeah, the GST, that's the only source of revenue for the states. No.
Yeah.
No, that's just what he gave them. And there's nothing stopping them figuring out, well, we'd love a small carbon tax, or we'd love a sugar tax, or a tax on Google, or whatever. We'll help you, federal government, sell it to the public.
Yeah.
And we promise we'll spend it all on this stuff the public wants. Done. We can have some real progressive federalism. So now the state premiers have stepped up to the plate. The voting public clearly like what they see. I hope they do more with it, not less.
So just looking back, what are some of the things that you're going to take away from 2020?
That you never know what's around the corner. That being right isn't nearly as important as having good timing, because for decades, we've argued that deficits won't ruin the economy or bankrupt the nation, and we were crazy lefties. And now it's Scott Morrison saying, relax, it's only a couple $100 bill.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be all right. So it's okay to let people change their minds. And why was it so hard to change people's minds before? I think we really need to reflect on why it was we were told we could never put human health ahead of the economy. Well, we have. We did, and it worked, and it was popular.
Yeah.
We were told the government couldn't possibly abandon budget surpluses, or, we have to worry about AAA credit ratings or something. No, we don't. We never did. So I think we really need to understand why those myths were there. Who put them there, who benefited from them, who sustained them for so long.
Yeah.
Because, people like myself disagreed with a lot of those myths, but now everyone can see, the Emperor's got no clothes. The Wizard of Oz, we've ripped the curtain away. It's just a skinny old guy with some levers. So all of that's fallen away. What do we do with that? Who was in charge of storytelling? Who was in charge of vetoes? Because the things that we were afraid of, credit ratings, running out of money, clearly weren't the problem. The things we were told that weren't a problem, underinvestment in health, underinvestment in diplomacy, guess what? Turned out to be big problems for us. So Australia's one of the richest countries in the world. We can do anything we want, but we can't do everything we want. We've just seen in the last 6 months that we really can do anything we want. We now need to have a new conversation about, well, what is that?
Yeah.
And it's clear that we can afford to do anything we want. We just have to want to do it. And we really want to give me a tax cut.
Yeah.
And we really don't want to help the unemployed. Well, it's a democracy. If that's what everyone really wants to do, I thank them again for their kindness. But really, I don't. I think a lot of people listening to this would much rather help the unemployed. Well, we can if we want to.
Yeah.
And we've just seen it. This government doubled the dole for a little while.
For a little while. Looking ahead to 2021, it doesn't look like we'll get another black summer of bushfires because we're in La Nina, but hopefully it's not a summer of disasters like we saw last year. If you're thinking forward and thinking hopefully about 2021, what do you think we're looking at?
Look, we're looking at an economy that is going to recover. The more money we spend and the more carefully we target that money, the quicker it will recover. So it's in everyone's interests to target the money to labour-intensive industries that deliver lasting benefits. We are going to spend a lot more money in the next couple of years. The recession, unfortunately, won't end quickly. As the economy grows out of it, it'll take a long time to chip into the damage. And the government knows that. The government's got an election coming up. The government can see that the Queensland Labor government was overwhelmingly re-elected by putting health first. It's going to be pretty hard for the federal government to abandon so many unemployed people and pivot away from health and pile up too much pain on casual workers, not only because it's wrong, but because there's an election in the offing.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That's been a special episode and our final episode of 2020 for Follow the Money. So thank you so much for sticking with us this year as we navigated the ups and downs of the pandemic. And don't forget to check out the Australia Institute's Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. You can find every single webinar that we've done this year up on our YouTube page. There's a whole playlist that's completely free and publicly available to anyone who missed any of those webinars this year. I think we spoke to something like 4 different Nobel Prize laureates, 2 prime ministers, a former president, people from across the political spectrum, academics, artists, all sorts of people. So please do check it out. But we really do thank you for listening all of this year. We've had a real explosion in the number of our listeners and we appreciate all of you.
And there's a whole free course in economics up there as well.
That's right. Economics Academy was also one of the really popular things that the Australia Institute did this year. So, yeah, there's 3 things for summer. Follow the Money, catch up on any episodes you missed this year, the Economics of a Pandemic webinar series and our Economics Academy. For the latest health information, don't forget to check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent CoronaCast podcast. And for all the latest research and content from the Australia Institute, visit our website at tai.org.au. And we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and you can find Richard at RDNS_TAI. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum, and additional music from Epidemic Sound and Blue Dot Sessions. Have a really safe summer. I hope it's relaxing and not stressful. Keep washing those hands, stay 1.5 metres away from one another, and have a really excellent break. Thanks for listening, and we'll speak to you in 2021.